Search and Rescue by Kerry, Hammond. Part 7. Content warnings, death of children and infants, descriptions of gore and bodily injury, profanity. One of the topics that I get asked about a lot here and in real life involve things like the rake, the Wendigo, and other related legends. I can't honestly say that I know a lot about any of them, but based on some light reading I did, I can say that I've heard stories that seem to be loosely related to them. You've heard the old adage that legends like that come from somewhere, right? I'm sure that's true, but as you all know, I do try to take things with a grain of salt. You have to, out here. It's sort of like working in a hospital. You could spend all day thinking about how many people have died here and how there are probably ghosts, or whatever you want to call them, all over the place, but it doesn't do you any good. It just makes it harder to do your job. I think a lot of us feel that way, and that's why we try to just go about our work like everything is fine. Once you get paranoid, there's not really any going back, and a lot of cadets quit because of it. My park especially seems to have a high turnover rate because the cadets graduate and get so freaked out about everything and they can't seem to let it go. And you have to learn, you have to learn to internalize this stuff and shut it off. I've talked to KD a bit about her experience because I wanted to know what she thought about the Wendigo. She didn't really have anything in particular to say about it, apart from that she didn't want to think about it that much, but she told me a friend of hers had had something similar happen. I contacted this person, H, over Skype, and they agreed to talk to me a bit. They're aware of my work here, and they're fine with me posting the story exactly as they wrote it. So here we go. I grew up in Central Oregon, and there's a reservation called Warm Springs, about 2 or so hours from where I lived. I only mention that because a lot of people in my area have friends there, and a lot of the land in that area belongs to that tribe. When I was a kid, we used to go camping up there. Not on the res, of course, but in that area. And I met a lot of kids who grew up there. I got to know one kid really well. His name was Nolan, and we ended up hanging out a lot when our families were in the area. Our folks got to know each other, so we'd all get in touch and camp out around the same time. We camped for about 2 weeks, so we were out there for a long time. I asked him if he camped in an RV. Yeah, my dad had one. So I guess it wasn't really camping, but we'd take our tents and stuff and set them up out away from camp most nights. I didn't like sleeping in there because I like being outside. We talked for a bit about camping. So, anyway, sorry, one year Nolan and I were out there. I think we must have been like 12 or something. We wanted to go out and camp near the river because we wanted to try night fishing. I think we must have been about a third of a mile from the main camp, far enough away that we couldn't see or hear anyone else. I remember that much. We were messing around most of the day. I don't really remember much about it, but we ended up building a fire at some point, and I was really impressed because he had this flint or something that he used to start it. I'd never seen anyone do that before, so I thought it was pretty cool. I got him to teach me how to do it, and we lit some stuff on fire, which looking back was really stupid because it was the middle of fucking summer. If I remember right, the fire warning was yellow or orange, but thankfully we didn't start anything major. And when it got dark, we sat around and talked about whatever it is 12-year-olds talk about. I don't really remember. What I do remember is that at some point he looked over my shoulder at the river and asked me if I could see something. Now, the way our camp was set up, we were about 10 feet from the river, and we were at the widest point, so it was probably about 20 feet to the other bank. It gets hot up there in the summer, but the water's still cold, and that's really important. I look over my shoulder, and I could see something wading into the river on the other side. From where we were, it looked like a deer, but we couldn't really tell because of the fire. I got up to look closer, saw a pair of antlers, so I figured it was a buck. But I thought it was weird that it was wading into the water, and it was definitely heading for us. And I asked Nolan what he thought we should do. He's looking at the fire with this weird expression, and he tells me to sit down and shut up. So I do, because I'd never seen him act that way before. He's whispering at me, ignore it, and to just keep talking like we were, but I couldn't think of anything to say. He was saying something about some episode of some show, but I could hear the deer coming through the water, so I wasn't really paying any attention, and I kept trying to see over his shoulder, but every time I did, he sort of hit me on the arm and make me look at him. I wasn't really scared. I remember that. I was just sort of confused. But then I hear the deer come out of the water, and I could kind of make out what it looked like, and I realised it wasn't a deer, because whatever it was walking on two legs. I started to get up. I was super freaked out, but Nolan just yanked me back down and talked louder about this television show, and I could tell he was just as scared as I was, probably even more. He leaned in, poked the fire with a stick, and he whispered that whatever I do, I can't speak to it. I could see it come closer, and it stood right behind Nolan's back. I was about ready to pee my pants, to be honest, and I think I'd probably have run if I'd been alone. But I didn't want to leave Nolan, so I kept sitting really still and sneaking glances at it. It wasn't that tall, but the way it carried itself was just wrong. Like its centre of balance was screwed up. I can't really describe it, but it was kind of like it kept shifting too far forwards. I just stood there behind Nolan for a long time, and eventually Nolan ran out of things to say. And we just kind of sat there for a second. The fire was making noise, but I think I could hear this thing talking in a really, really low voice. I couldn't hear what it was saying, and I leaned forward a tiny little bit, and I actually did pee my pants when it leaned forward too. I couldn't see its face, but I saw its eyes. They were cloudy and milky, and if you want to know what they look like, find that scene from Lord of the Rings where Frodo falls in that lake and all the dead people are floating towards him. That's what its eyes looked like. So all I saw were these two white eyes floating above Nolan's head and the really vague shape of the antlers coming out of its head, and I don't know what my face looked like, but at exactly the same time Nolan and I fucking booked it out of there, and we ran non-stop until we got back to the main camp. My pants were soaked with pee, so I took them off as we were running and threw them in the bushes. We both stopped once we were in front of my dad's RV, and we couldn't see anything chasing us, so we stood there and caught our breath. I asked him what that thing was, and he said he didn't know. He said his grandpa had only warned him that if anything ever came up to him when he was out in the desert, he was never, ever supposed to talk to it or listen to anything it had to say. I wanted to know if he'd heard talking too, and he said the only thing he'd been able to understand was "help you." I think we ended up sleeping in the RV with my parents, and the next night we went back out and didn't see anything. That does remind me in a lot of ways of the Wendigo legend. There's a phrase used to describe it that I think fits perfectly, which is that the Wendigo is the spirit of the lonely places. I know sometimes when I'm out in the wilds, when I know there's no one around me for miles and miles, I get this weird kind of craving that I can't really explain. I don't know if it happens to anyone else, but it's this desire to consume. It's not like I crave anything in particular, but more of this weird distracting hunger that comes from every part of my gut. I also wanted to find out more about the Faceless Man, if I was able, and found a few similar things. I asked around my circle of friends, and one of them said when he was out doing repairs at a park in his area, he saw something kind of like that. We were having dinner in town, 5 of us, including myself. This guy, he was repainting an information booth and heard a man asking for directions to the nearest campsite. He didn't turn around because he was up on a ladder, but he informed the guy that there weren't any campsites nearby, but that if he headed down the road about 4 miles, he'd find one at another park. He asked if he could be of any other help, but the man said no and thanked him. My friend said he kept painting, but he was listening and never heard the man leave. The second he came up and talked to me, the hairs on my neck stood up, but I wasn't sure why. I just had this really uneasy feeling about the whole thing, and I wanted to finish painting and get out of there. I figured maybe part of it was that I couldn't turn around to look at him, but something just felt off. There was this weird smell floating around even before the guy talked to me, kind of like old period blood. I looked around to see what was causing it, but I couldn't find anything. So I waited for the guy to walk away, but I didn't hear him leave, which made me think he was just standing there and watching me. So I asked, again, if I could do anything for him, and he didn't answer. I knew he was there, though, because I hadn't heard him leave. So I did this awkward turn on the ladder to look down and see what he was doing. Now, I admit it could have just been my brain fucking up, but I swear to you, Russ, for a split second when I turned around, that fucker didn't have a face. Like, no face. Nothing. It was almost concave and totally smooth. And I just about had a fucking heart attack because I couldn't even wrap my brain around what I was seeing. I think I started to say something, but there was this kind of pop inside my head, and suddenly it was just a normal looking guy. I must have looked weird because he asked me if I was okay, and I was like, yeah, I'm fine. He asks about the campsite again, and I point to where he has to go, and he's like, I'm not from around here. Can you help me get there? Now, this is when I knew something is really up, because there's no way this guy got out here and didn't know where he was. And for that matter, there's no car around. So how'd he get here in the first place? I said I was sorry, but that I couldn't take him anywhere in a company vehicle. And he's like, please, I really don't know where I am. Can you come with me and help me get there? So now I'm seriously weirded out, and I start wondering if this is some sort of ambush or whatever. I told him I could call him a taxi to come out and take him where he wants to go. And I pull out my phone and he just goes, no. And walks away really quickly. But he doesn't walk out of the park. He walks back into the fucking tree line. And I get right in my fucking truck and start to get out of there. Fuck the paint or whatever. I looked in my mirror to see where he was as I was leaving. And he's just standing at the tree line. I don't know how he got there so fast, but this time I know that fucker didn't have a face. He was just watching me leave, and right before I turned the corner, he took a big step back into the trees and just kind of dissolved. Maybe it was just dark, so he blended in. But it felt more like he just melted away. Interestingly, right after this guy finished his story, someone else piped up with another one, but with a slightly different twist. You know, actually, I had something sort of weird happen like that a while back. I was out doing some trail scouting, and I was out in the middle of nowhere, figuring out where we were going to have this trail run through. I hadn't seen anyone else for about 2 hours. I wasn't really paying attention to where I was going, if I'm honest. I was just looking at the ground for the most part. Then, out of nowhere, I crested this little hill and almost ran into this guy. He was older, probably in his 60s, and I started to apologize to him for running into him. And then I noticed his face, and I probably looked like a complete douchebag because I stopped and just stared at him. It took me a second to figure out what was wrong. But this guy's face was huge. I know that sounds weird, but that's the only way I can describe it. His head wasn't big or anything. It was normal, but the amount of space his face took up was just way too much. Like if you took someone's face and enlarged it by about 2 times. He doesn't say anything. He just kind of looks at me. And I backed up and I was kind of stuttering and saying, oh, I'm terribly sorry. And I went around him and fucking got out of there and did what I needed to do. The whole time, I kept looking behind me because I was so freaked out that he'd pop up or something. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I swear to you, it was one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. I switched the topic to the stairs a little later, and there was a definite shift in enthusiasm. No one spoke up at first. There's a real stigma around discussing them, even when we were away from work. But I broke the ice with a story of my own, and the guy who told me about the faceless man told this one, albeit quite quietly. A couple of years ago, I was camping with my girlfriend, and we're out about 2 miles from the road at this site I know. We went to bed that night, but we couldn't sleep because someone interjected a funny comment, and we were dangerously close to going off on another subject, but I got us on track. Yeah, really funny, fucker. No, it was because we kept hearing that grinding noise. My brother used to grind his teeth in his sleep, and it kind of reminds me of that. My girlfriend was freaking out, but I just kept telling her to ignore it, because I've heard it before, and you just have to ignore it. It goes away eventually. You guys know what I mean. We all know what he meant. So eventually I get her to go to sleep, but I woke up probably 2 hours later because something was just off. I rolled over, she wasn't there. I kind of freaked out because he thought for a second, and then he took a very, very long drink. Anyway, I ran out of the tent calling her name, but I didn't have to go far. She was standing at the edge of the camp looking at something in the trees, and I could see she was so pale. The fire was low, but bright enough to see her. Anyway, so I ran up to see what was going on, and she was dead asleep, but her eyes were open. And she had this real spaced out look, so I put my arm around her to lead her back. But she wouldn't move. She just said something really quietly, something like, "I have to go now, Eddie. I have to go. It's here." I was like, "You're just sleepwalking, come back to bed." But she wouldn't budge. She just kept standing there and saying that she had to go. And I looked where she was looking, and there was a fucking staircase about 15 yards away. Grey one. Concrete, and she started to walk towards it, but I yanked her back, and that woke her up. She looked at me like I was fucking out of my mind, and she asked what the fuck she was doing out of the tent. I didn't tell her, I just told her she was sleepwalking. The grinding was gone, so she just went back to the tent with me and fell asleep again. I don't know. I don't know. I don't like thinking about it, We all knew. You guys remember that kid with, I can't remember what it was, some kind of brain fuck up. Not Downs, something like it. Someone else was brought up. Well, I got to read the report he gave when they found him a week after he went missing, and it was fucked up beyond belief. I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because who knows what that kid actually thinks is real. But some of this stuff, Jesus, I don't think he could have made it up. Like what? Well, first of all, he talked about the stairs. He said he'd been watching his dad build a fire, and the stairs came up to him, and he had to go up them or something bad would happen. The cops couldn't really understand what he was talking about after that, because he just kept saying, like the campfire, over and over, and he just kept mentioning sounds, but he couldn't say what sounds, just that it was loud, and he covered his ears so he couldn't hear them. But the thing I remember most is that they asked him where exactly he'd gone, and he said he was right there. He kept pointing at himself, and they said they thought that meant that he thought he'd never left. He said he wasn't scared because the stairs were there, and he said they talked to him, but not like people talk. Like I said, really convoluted, hard to understand. I have a feeling the cops didn't take most of it down. They ended up just saying that the kid had some kind of amnesia or fugue, and that they didn't think foul play was involved. Doesn't really explain why he came back a week later perfectly fine without a speck of dirt on him and well fed, but hey, what the cops say goes, right? There are still a lot of questions I want to answer. I'll continue to ask around and find out whatever I can. The next update should be soon. Thanks for being so patient. Part 8. Content warnings. Death of children and infants. Descriptions of gore and bodily injury. Profanity. This will be my final update for now. Things have deteriorated here to a degree that I didn't foresee. I didn't know how much writing about the things that are happening out here would affect every single part of my life, and maybe that was stupid of me. Maybe I should have considered it more seriously, but honestly, I just thought I was writing about things a few people would want to hear. I never thought it would get this much attention. People ask me about the stairs now. Doesn't happen every day, but when it does, I never really know what to say. My bosses know someone is talking about them, and I'm sure that if they know, the higher-ups know. And I can tell you, none of them are happy about it. I've been formally told that I am not to speak a word about them to anyone anymore, which is part of the reason this has to be my final update. I can't risk my job for this. As much as it's been wonderful to get a lot of these things off my mind, I still do love my work, and I need to be out here. If anything, my being aware of what's really going on is enough reason to stick it out. I may not be able to tell people that they're out there, but if I see them, I can at least direct traffic away to somewhere safer. Because of the amount of attention the stories have gotten, I've heard a lot of stories being swapped back and forth. I've heard so many I can't even remember most of them. The ones I do remember are the ones that I wish I could forget. One story that's made the rounds here was about a woman who disappeared upstate. Young woman. Initially, everyone assumed she was a runaway. She didn't come from a great home life, and it really wasn't any kind of surprise that she would choose to cut and run. But people started coming forward saying that they've seen her around the park shortly before she vanished, so some of the rangers in the area were sent out to make sure she hadn't hung herself or something on any of the back trails. Took them a while. They did find her. Not all of her. Half of her tongue and a quarter of the lower jaw. Very clean cuts, from what I heard. The rest has never been found. So many stories about children. So many of them going missing and turning up in caves, wedged in between impossibly tight spaces. So many of them found on mountain peaks or at the bottom of sheer gullies, missing shoes, missing socks, or found with both in perfect condition despite them being miles and miles away from where they vanished. So many stories of black-eyed people wandering around the woods and calling out in the night, mimicking the sound of running water or a bobcat screaming. One man in particular goes to every news station he thinks will listen to him, and he tells the same story. He was deer hunting, had camped out in a very remote area, and woke up because something was scraping against his tent. He thought it was a raccoon or a fox until the thing pressed its face against the door, at which point he could very clearly make out a human nose and mouth. He kicked at it, but it leapt back and was gone by the time he opened the tent flap, gun at his side. Fired 2 warning shots, and when the sound had faded, he heard a snap behind him. A man was standing at the edge of the campsite. This man was not wearing any clothing, but he also did not possess any kind of human flesh. As this hunter described it, the man was made of some kind of amalgamation of raw meat and hair, as if someone had scooped up roadkill and moulded it into the vague shape of a man. The face was lumpy, only a rough approximation of a human face. It opened its lopsided mouth, and from it came the sound of the gun the hunter had just fired. It did this twice before mimicking the sound of the tent zipper and fleeing into the night. A young couple out for a hike in the rocky areas of my park reported to me yesterday that they had seen something strange out on a peak I am very familiar with. They were taking turns looking through a pair of binoculars when the man noticed a hiker climbing up a very steep part of the cliff face. He watched the man scale the slope, and it didn't occur to him until the incident was over that this person had no climbing gear. When the climber reached the top of the peak, which was about 5 miles away, they turned and faced the young man. He said whoever or whatever this person was looking right at them. The climber waved in an exaggerated manner before snapping in half at the waist, sideways, and leaping off the peak. The young man didn't see where the climber landed. I sent them on their way with assurances that I'd check it out, and I lied. I won't be turning in a report because there are 10 others exactly like it. The climber is well known in that area. I don't question it anymore. There are so many things I won't ever be able to understand about my job, and it would take me years to relate all of the things I've heard in the last few months. When I feel like my job isn't in jeopardy, I will come back. It may be in a different format, but I will come back. Thank you all for sticking by my side and enjoying the things I've talked about. If you go out into the woods, I encourage you to be safe. Bring water, food, survival equipment, let people know where you're going and when you will be back. Don't go on uncharted paths unless you know exactly what you're doing. And above all, don't touch them. Don't look at them. Don't go up them.